Some doors are designed to keep strangers out, but the most dangerous ones are guarded by pride instead of locks. Daniel Mercer tightened his grip on the handcrafted cedar box as he stood beneath the towering glass entrance of Hale Development Group in downtown Portland. Morning sunlight reflected across polished steel columns and spotless marble floors while executives, investors, and invited guests streamed confidently through the revolving doors. His clean blue work shirt had been carefully pressed before sunrise, yet beside tailored suits and expensive shoes, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. Beside him stood his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, wearing a simple navy cardigan and holding a well-worn notebook close against her chest. She glanced up at her father with quiet confidence instead of worry. "We are early," she whispered. Daniel smiled gently. Being early is another way of showing respect. He checked the folded invitation inside his jacket one more time. Arthur Bennett had personally asked him to arrive before the quarterly leadership meeting, and Daniel never ignored a promise. As they stepped toward the front entrance, a uniformed receptionist greeted arriving executives with practiced warmth before suddenly hesitating as Daniel approached. Before she could speak, a calm but unmistakably authoritative voice interrupted from behind the reception desk. "Excuse me." Daniel turned and found himself looking directly at Victoria Hale, the 36-year-old chief executive officer whose reputation for discipline had become legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her elegant cream-colored business suit reflected quiet confidence, and every movement suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions without hesitation. She studied Daniel for only a few seconds before allowing her eyes to settle on the cedar box in his hands. "Deliveries are accepted through the service entrance on the east side of the building," she said politely but firmly. Daniel answered with the same calm expression. "I'm not making a delivery. I was invited to meet Mr. Bennett." Victoria's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Several nearby executives slowed their pace, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Preston Cole, the company's ambitious executive vice president, stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. A faint smile crossed his face. Arthur Bennett does not schedule private meetings with contractors standing in the lobby carrying wooden boxes. Quiet laughter drifted through the entrance hall. Daniel never reacted. He simply unfolded the invitation and offered it respectfully. Victoria glanced toward the card without taking it. "If someone mistakenly gave you access to today's meeting, we will gladly help resolve the confusion." Lily looked toward her father. "Dad." Daniel placed one reassuring hand lightly against her shoulder. "Everything is all right." Victoria maintained her professional composure, although impatience had begun replacing courtesy. "Sir, I need to keep the entrance clear for our guests." Daniel nodded once. "Then I will wait over there until Mr. Bennett arrives." Preston chuckled softly. "You may be waiting a very long time." Daniel only smiled. Good things are worth waiting for. The marble lobby seemed to grow quieter as conversations gradually faded. Even the revolving doors slowed between arrivals. Then the private executive elevator opened with a soft chime. Arthur Bennett, the 72-year-old chairman of the board and founder of the company, stepped into the lobby wearing a simple navy blazer instead of the formal attire everyone expected. Every executive immediately straightened. Victoria turned toward him, prepared to welcome the chairman, but Arthur never looked in her direction. He walked directly past the senior leadership team, crossed the polished marble floor without hesitation, and stopped in front of Daniel. A warm smile spread across his face before he reached forward with both hands and firmly shook Daniel's hand. "My friend," Arthur said with unmistakable gratitude. "Without you, a piece of my family's history would have been lost forever." Complete silence settled across the lobby. Victoria stared at the two men in disbelief. Preston's confident smile disappeared. Daniel quietly handed Arthur the handcrafted cedar box. Arthur rested one hand gently on its lid before looking toward the executives surrounding them. "I hope everyone is ready," he said calmly, "because the most important guest in this building has finally arrived." Arthur Bennett carried the cedar box himself instead of asking an assistant to do it, and that single gesture changed the atmosphere more than any speech ever could. Executives who had walked through the lobby with effortless confidence only moments earlier now exchanged uncertain glances, searching one another's faces for an explanation that nobody seemed able to provide. Victoria Hale followed several steps behind, maintaining her professional composure even as questions gathered faster than answers inside her mind. Daniel Mercer walked beside Arthur with the same quiet humility he had displayed outside the entrance, while Lily matched her father's calm pace without looking impressed by the polished hallways or priceless artwork surrounding them. She had seen enough of her father to know that respect was something earned long before anyone noticed it. Arthur led them into a private conference room overlooking the Willamette River. The walls displayed photographs tracing the company's history across 5 decades, yet his attention remained fixed on the cedar box resting carefully in his hands. He placed it gently upon the walnut conference table and paused before opening the lid, almost as though he feared disturbing something sacred. "I have waited 2 years to see this again," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I wanted to make certain it reached the right hands." Arthur slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a beautifully restored leather journal, several carefully preserved blueprints tied with faded cotton ribbon, and a black and white photograph protected beneath clear archival paper. Time itself seemed to slow. Arthur picked up the photograph with steady hands that suddenly looked much older than they had outside the lobby. A small boy smiled beside an unfinished brick factory, while a younger man rested one hand proudly upon his shoulder. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "That was my father," he whispered, "and that little boy was me." Nobody interrupted the silence that followed. Even Preston Cole remained motionless. Arthur opened the leather journal and gently turned several pages before stopping at a handwritten note near the back. His breathing became noticeably slower. "I never knew this page existed." Daniel folded his hands together. The journal had been hidden inside a false compartment beneath the floor of an abandoned boarding house scheduled for demolition. Most people would have thrown everything away with the old lumber. Arthur looked toward him with gratitude that could not be measured in dollars or titles. "But you did not." Daniel smiled softly. "Some things become more valuable simply because someone remembers they matter." Victoria watched every exchange without speaking. She had expected excuses from the man she had dismissed downstairs. Instead, she found quiet integrity that asked for nothing in return. Arthur carefully unfolded one of the original blueprints and spread it across the table. Pencil marks filled the margins beside neat measurements drawn decades earlier. "These are the original plans for our first manufacturing building," he explained. "I believe they disappeared after the flood in 1978. Daniel gently pointed toward one corner where fresh restoration work blended almost invisibly with the aged paper. The lower edge had severe water damage. "I repaired only what was necessary. I wanted your father's handwriting to remain exactly as he left it." Arthur looked at Daniel for several long seconds before saying, "Do you know what these papers are worth?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "To collectors, probably a great deal. To your family, they are beyond any price." Arthur smiled warmly. "Exactly." Victoria lowered her eyes toward the table, remembering every assumption she had made less than 15 minutes earlier. Her position had taught her to judge efficiency in seconds, but it had never taught her how quickly pride could make an intelligent person overlook character. Lily quietly reached into her notebook and removed a small pressed maple leaf. She placed it beside the journal. Arthur looked at her with curiosity. "What is this for?" Lily smiled. "My dad says history is easier to protect when people leave kindness inside it." Arthur carefully placed the maple leaf between the journal pages before closing the cover. He looked around the room and spoke with calm certainty. "Our meeting today is no longer about redevelopment. It is about remembering what this company was built to protect." Victoria slowly lifted her eyes toward Daniel, and for the first time since they had met that morning, she no longer saw a man standing at the wrong door. She saw someone who had quietly carried the right key all along. Arthur Bennett closed the restored journal with extraordinary care before sliding it back into the cedar box. The room remained unusually quiet, not because anyone had run out of words, but because every person present understood they had witnessed something money could never replace. Arthur slowly stood and looked toward Daniel with genuine appreciation. I have spent years searching for these pieces of my family's history, he said. Every museum, every archive, every collector came back with nothing. Then a craftsman who expected nothing in return quietly brought them home. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. I only finished the journey they had already started. Arthur smiled before walking toward the windows overlooking the city. Daniel, I want to purchase the journal, the blueprints, and everything inside that box. Name your price. Victoria folded her hands together, expecting a negotiation that would likely reach 6 figures. Preston Cole leaned back confidently, convinced everyone eventually revealed a number when enough money entered the conversation. Daniel remained silent for several seconds before gently shaking his head. I cannot sell something that never truly belonged to me. Arthur turned slowly. Then allow me to reward you. Daniel answered with the same peaceful voice. The reward came the day I realized these documents had survived. Returning them is simply the right thing to do. Preston finally broke the silence with a polite laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. With respect, Mr. Mercer, everyone has a price. Daniel looked toward him without resentment. No, sir. Everyone has values. Sometimes people confuse the two. The words landed softly, yet no one in the room seemed eager to respond. Arthur's smile widened. That may be the wisest sentence spoken inside this building all year. Lily quietly watched the adults before reaching into her notebook again. She removed a tiny wooden bookmark that Daniel had carved from leftover cedar. Delicate tree rings remained visible beneath a thin layer of natural oil. She handed it to Arthur. My dad says books remember people better when someone cares for them. Arthur accepted the small gift with visible emotion. Then I will use this every day. Victoria observed the exchange with growing admiration. She had built an entire career around measurable results, quarterly reports, and strategic planning. Yet sitting across from Daniel forced her to confront a different kind of success, one that could not be calculated on any balance sheet. Arthur returned to his chair and unfolded another blueprint across the polished table. His fingers stopped near the center of the drawing. This is the original Bennett Foundry. We are preparing to redevelop the entire property into a mixed-use project next spring. Daniel studied the faded lines carefully without speaking. After nearly a minute, he pointed toward one corner where several measurements intersected. These dimensions do not match the supporting foundation. Preston immediately answered. Those drawings are over 50 years old. The engineering team has already completed updated surveys. Daniel nodded respectfully. Perhaps, but old buildings tell the truth differently than new paperwork. Arthur leaned closer. Explain. Daniel traced one weathered pencil line with remarkable precision. If these measurements are original, then a lower level should exist beneath the eastern wing. It would have been built before modern safety codes changed. If someone removed it from recent plans without documenting the change, there may be more history hidden beneath that site than anyone realizes. Victoria looked toward Preston. Were underground spaces included in the redevelopment survey? Preston answered almost instantly. Everything important has already been documented. Daniel did not challenge him. He simply rolled the blueprint closed and looked toward Arthur. The building deserves one careful walk before anyone decides its future. Arthur nodded without hesitation. Tomorrow morning. Victoria looked surprised. Personally, Arthur smiled. Some decisions are too important to delegate. He turned toward Daniel once more. I would like you to join us as my guest. Daniel hesitated. I am only a woodworker. Arthur gently placed one hand on the cedar box. No. You are someone who knows how to recognize value after everyone else has stopped looking. That is exactly who I want walking beside me. Victoria quietly lowered her eyes, remembering the service entrance she had pointed toward less than an hour earlier. For the first time in many years, she wondered whether leadership began not by opening the right doors, but by learning whom she should have welcomed through them in the first place. The following morning arrived beneath clear Oregon skies as a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of damp cedar, old brick, and freshly cut grass across the abandoned Bennett Foundry. Daniel Mercer parked his aging pickup truck beside a temporary construction fence while Lily remained inside with a library book, happily promising to finish another chapter before he returned. Arthur Bennett stepped out of a black sedan, wearing sturdy walking shoes instead of polished dress shoes, and Victoria Hale arrived moments later carrying rolled engineering plans beneath one arm. Preston Cole greeted everyone with confident efficiency, already wearing a white safety helmet and speaking about schedules, budgets, and deadlines before anyone had crossed the entrance gate. Daniel quietly adjusted the borrowed hard hat resting on his head and looked toward the weathered brick buildings stretching across nearly 12 acres. Broken windows reflected the morning sun, faded steel beams rose above cracked concrete, and vines climbed walls that had once echoed with the sound of hundreds of hard-working families earning honest paychecks. Arthur stood still for several moments before speaking. "My father spent more time here than he did at home." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Buildings remember the people who cared for them." Preston smiled politely. "Fortunately, we are here to prepare the property for its future instead of dwelling on its past." Arthur simply gestured forward. "Let us see everything before we decide what stays and what goes." The group entered through enormous steel doors that groaned softly as they opened. Dust floated through beams of sunlight pouring from broken skylights overhead. Every footstep echoed across the empty factory floor, while forgotten machines rested beneath protective tarps like silent witnesses waiting to tell their stories. Victoria studied digital floor plans on her tablet, comparing measurements with numbered support columns placed throughout the building. Daniel walked several steps behind everyone else, occasionally resting one hand against old brick walls or weathered wooden railings as though listening instead of merely looking. After nearly 15 minutes, he stopped beside a rusted steel column marked with faded white paint. He looked upward, then toward another support beam across the room. "Something does not match," he said quietly. Preston barely slowed his pace. The structural survey was completed by one of the best engineering firms in the country. Daniel calmly replied, "I am not questioning their experience. I am questioning these numbers." Victoria turned toward him. "What do you see?" Daniel pointed toward the column. "This beam carries more weight than it should if the lower level shown on your current plans is complete. The load distribution suggests another foundation below us." Preston folded his arms. "There is no additional foundation. We reviewed every available document." Daniel knelt beside a crack running through the old concrete floor and brushed away decades of accumulated dust with the palm of his hand. A small circular iron ring slowly appeared beneath the debris. Arthur stepped closer with growing curiosity. Daniel gently pulled upward. The ring resisted at first before revealing the outline of a square steel hatch hidden almost perfectly within the concrete. Nobody spoke. Even Preston remained silent. Victoria slowly looked down at the engineering plans in her hands before looking back at the hatch. "There is nothing about this on any of our redevelopment drawings." Daniel smiled faintly. "Old buildings usually hide important things in places where people stop paying attention." Arthur carefully knelt beside him and rested one weathered hand against the cold steel cover. His voice became almost a whisper. "I remember my father telling me about a shelter beneath the factory during the flood when I was very young. I thought it was only a childhood memory." Daniel examined the worn hinges before answering. "Sometimes memories survive because they are trying to protect the truth." Preston immediately recovered his confidence. "Even if there is an old storage room underneath, it does not change the redevelopment schedule." Daniel stood slowly and looked toward the aging brick walls surrounding them. "Maybe not. But if someone removed an entire level from the official plans without recording it, then we should ask why." Victoria's eyes shifted from the hidden hatch to Preston, whose expression remained carefully controlled despite the unmistakable tension settling across the room. Arthur looked at both of them before giving a calm instruction that allowed no debate. "Nobody touches this site until we know exactly what has been hidden beneath our feet." Victoria Hale spent the remainder of the inspection speaking very little. The discovery beneath the factory floor had unsettled her in ways she could not explain, and every confident answer Preston Cole offered now sounded slightly rehearsed. Arthur Bennett instructed an independent engineering team to secure the hidden hatch without opening it until historical records could be reviewed, then thanked Daniel Mercer once again before returning to corporate headquarters for an emergency board meeting. Daniel simply nodded, climbed into his aging pickup truck, and drove away with Lily sitting quietly beside him. Neither of them spoke for several miles. They had learned long ago that important days often became clearer after silence had done its work. By late afternoon, the familiar scent of cedar welcomed them home as Daniel unlocked the door to his modest woodworking shop on the edge of Portland. Warm sunlight filtered through wide windows, illuminating carefully organized hand tools, neatly stacked lumber, unfinished rocking chairs, and shelves lined with restored family heirlooms waiting to be returned to their owners. Nothing inside the shop looked expensive, yet everything reflected patience, craftsmanship, and care. Lily placed her backpack beside a small wooden desk in the corner before opening her homework without being asked. Daniel hung his work jacket, swept fresh wood shavings from the floor, and quietly resumed restoring an old oak dining chair that belonged to a retired schoolteacher who could not afford a replacement. The rhythmic sound of sandpaper moving across weathered wood filled the room with peaceful familiarity. About 30 minutes later, the soft ring of the shop bell interrupted the quiet afternoon. Daniel looked up with mild surprise as Victoria stepped inside carrying no briefcase, no tablet, and no executive assistant. She wore simple slacks beneath a light sweater instead of business attire, making her appear less like the leader of a billion-dollar company and more like someone searching for answers she could not find inside conference rooms. The rich aroma of cedar surrounded her immediately. She slowly looked around the workshop, taking in every carefully labeled drawer, every restored piece of furniture, and every photograph hanging along one wall. Some showed smiling customers receiving repaired family heirlooms. Others showed Lily helping her father measure boards while wearing oversized safety glasses. Daniel set the chair aside and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon." Victoria returned the greeting almost shyly. "I hope I am not interrupting." Daniel glanced toward the unfinished chair. "Wood is patient. It can wait." Lily looked up from her homework and smiled warmly. "Hello again." Victoria smiled back before noticing a collection of small wooden nameplates resting on a nearby table. Each one carried a different name carefully carved into polished walnut. "What are these?" she asked. Daniel picked one up gently. The old factory employed generations of families. Some original locker nameplates were too damaged to save, so I have been recreating them from photographs found in local archives. Victoria examined one closely. Every letter had been carved by hand with extraordinary precision. "Nobody asked you to do this." Daniel quietly shook his head. "Some people should still be remembered even after the buildings change." Victoria slowly walked through the workshop until she reached a shelf displaying children's toys, repaired clocks, family picture frames, and an old church pew waiting for refinishing. "You restore almost everything." Daniel smiled. "Only things that still have a story left inside them." Lily closed her notebook and looked toward Victoria with innocent curiosity. "Dad says people are a little like old furniture." Victoria laughed softly. "How is that?" Lily answered without hesitation. "Sometimes they look damaged because nobody has cared for them in a long time. That does not mean they cannot become beautiful again." The words settled gently over the room. Victoria lowered her eyes, remembering the front entrance, the service door she had pointed toward, and the assumptions she had made before learning Daniel's name. She finally spoke with complete honesty. "Yesterday, I judged you before I knew anything about you. We found something else that should never have disappeared." Victoria Hale drove through the evening streets of Portland with Arthur Bennett's message replaying in her thoughts. She had entered Daniel Mercer's workshop expecting to understand a craftsman, but she left wondering whether she truly understood the company she had spent years leading. When she arrived at corporate headquarters, Arthur was already waiting inside a small archive room that few employees even knew existed. Several cardboard storage boxes rested upon a long oak table, each covered with decades of dust. Beside them stood an independent historian and two engineers reviewing recently recovered documents from beneath the hidden steel hatch. Arthur looked up as Victoria entered. "We opened the lower level," he said quietly. "You need to see what was left behind." He carefully unfolded a faded map recovered from a weatherproof metal cabinet hidden beneath the factory floor. Unlike the modern redevelopment plans, this drawing showed an entire underground shelter connected to the eastern wing. More surprising was a large room labeled Community Hall, a space completely absent from every document currently used by the company. The historian adjusted his glasses before speaking. This was not simply an emergency shelter. It was built for workers and their families. During difficult seasons, the company provided meals, job training, and childcare here. Arthur slowly nodded. My father believed the factory existed because families existed, not the other way around. Victoria compared the recovered drawing with the redevelopment plans displayed on her tablet. The difference was impossible to ignore. Entire sections had vanished without explanation. She looked toward the engineering reports submitted months earlier. Who approved these revisions? One engineer answered carefully. Every revision passed through executive development before reaching your office. Victoria's expression tightened. Executive development reported directly to Preston Cole. Arthur remained calm. I have spent my life believing those rooms were lost to time. Instead, someone removed them from memory. Meanwhile, several miles away, Daniel closed his workshop for the evening as Lily finished placing tools back into their proper drawers. She noticed her father looking thoughtfully toward the old cedar box resting on a shelf. Do you think they found something important? She asked. Daniel smiled gently. Truth usually leaves more than one clue. Before he could lock the front door, a local pastor arrived carrying an antique wooden church pew damaged by years of use. I know you are busy, the pastor said apologetically, but the community center dedication is next month. Daniel welcomed him inside without hesitation. Let us see what can be saved. The pastor glanced around the workshop. People keep telling me you should charge much more for your work. Daniel quietly sanded one worn edge of the pew before answering. If every decision begins with money, eventually money becomes the only thing people know how to measure. Back at headquarters, Victoria requested every archived redevelopment record connected to the old factory. Hour after hour, she compared signatures, approval dates, engineering revisions, and financial summaries. A pattern slowly emerged. Buildings could settle with age, wood could weather, and bricks could crack, but paper only changed when someone chose to change it. As the first light of dawn began touching the skyline, Arthur entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside Victoria without saying a word. She looked at him with quiet determination. Tomorrow I am going to ask questions that should have been asked months ago. Arthur smiled gently. Good. Because the people who protect the truth rarely begin by speaking louder. They begin by refusing to look away. The next morning began with quiet determination instead of celebration. Victoria Hale arrived at headquarters before sunrise carrying a leather portfolio filled with copied records, engineering reports, ownership filings, and handwritten notes she had organized throughout the night. Outside her office windows, Portland slowly awakened beneath pale gray clouds, while inside the executive floor only the soft hum of ventilation disturbed the silence. She placed 3 folders side by side across the conference table. The first contained the original factory blueprints recovered by Daniel Mercer. The second held the revised redevelopment plans approved months earlier. The third contained public corporate records connecting the investment company purchasing the eastern parcel to a managing partner who shared Preston Cole's family name. Arthur Bennett entered quietly carrying his familiar cup of coffee. He studied the organized documents before looking at Victoria with calm approval. You did not sleep much. She smiled faintly. Some questions become impossible to ignore once you know where to look. Arthur rested one hand on the original blueprint. Today is not about protecting my company. He looked toward the old drawing for several thoughtful seconds before finishing his sentence. It is about protecting the reason this company was created. Meanwhile, Daniel unlocked his woodworking shop exactly at 8 o'clock, believing his role in the story had likely ended. He swept the floor, sharpened his hand tools, and continued restoring the church pew the local pastor had delivered the previous evening. Lily sat nearby reading while soft morning light filled the workshop with the comforting scent of cedar and fresh coffee. Neither of them expected visitors. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a familiar sedan stopped outside. Victoria stepped from the driver's seat alone, carrying no corporate files, no assistant, and no carefully rehearsed confidence. Daniel welcomed her inside with the same quiet kindness he had offered every previous guest. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The gentle rhythm of sandpaper moving across oak filled the silence. Finally, Victoria took a slow breath. "I owe you more than an apology." Daniel set the wooden pew aside and looked at her patiently. "Go on." She lowered her eyes. "Because I wanted the truth to be discovered for the right reason, not because people were chasing another surprise." Victoria closed her fingers around the key. "Do you think something important is behind that door?" Daniel looked toward the workshop windows where autumn leaves drifted gently across the yard. Old builders rarely locked away things they wanted forgotten. They locked away things they hoped someone honest would eventually protect. That afternoon, Victoria, Arthur, two independent historians, and a structural engineer returned to the underground level. Using Daniel's key, they carefully opened the weathered wooden door hidden beyond the shelter. Inside, they discovered shelves filled with payroll ledgers, community meeting records, handwritten letters from workers' families, and an audio recorder preserved inside a protective cabinet. One label immediately caught Arthur's attention. Written in his father's handwriting were the simple words, "For whoever leads after me." Arthur quietly lifted the recorder into both hands, and no one in the room spoke because they all understood that some voices could wait half a century before finally being heard. The special board meeting began just after 9 o'clock on a clear Thursday morning. Every seat surrounding the long walnut conference table had been filled before the scheduled start, and additional department leaders quietly gathered along the back wall after hearing unexpected rumors spread throughout the building overnight. Daniel Mercer accepted Arthur Bennett's invitation, but chose a chair near the far end of the room instead of sitting beside the chairman. Lily remained at Daniel's workshop with the local pastor, happily helping polish the restored church pew while reading another chapter from her favorite library book. Victoria Hale entered carrying 3 neatly organized binders and a small portable audio player carefully protected inside a padded case. Preston Cole greeted everyone with his usual confidence, offering polished smiles and speaking comfortably about redevelopment timelines, investor expectations, and projected financial returns. Nothing in his expression suggested concern. Arthur calmly opened the meeting before looking toward Victoria. "You requested today's agenda. Please begin." Victoria stood without hesitation. The room became perfectly still. "During the past 48 hours," she began, "our company discovered original historical records that were removed from redevelopment planning many years ago. Those discoveries required an independent review of every revision made to the Bennett Foundry project." Preston leaned back with folded arms. "I assume this is simply a procedural update." Victoria looked directly at him. "No, it is an accountability update." She opened the first binder and projected the original factory blueprint onto the large presentation screen. This drawing, preserved by Daniel Mercer, shows an underground community hall designed by our founder for workers and their families. She opened the second binder. This is the redevelopment plan submitted to the executive committee. The entire section no longer exists. Quiet whispers spread through the room before disappearing almost immediately. Victoria pressed another button. Financial records appeared beside the engineering drawings. Independent review also found that the eastern parcel scheduled for sale was linked to an investment company managed by an individual sharing direct family ties with Executive Vice President Preston Cole. Preston immediately stood. "That does not prove wrongdoing." Victoria nodded calmly. "Correct. By itself, it does not." She opened the third binder. "That is why there is a third piece." The screen changed again, displaying approval dates, document revisions, and electronic authorization records aligned in chronological order. Every removal of historical facilities, every reduction of community space, and every transfer recommendation passed through one executive office before reaching mine. Nobody interrupted. Preston looked around the room searching for support, but found only lowered eyes and silent faces. Arthur finally spoke. There is one final item. He carefully placed the small audio player onto the conference table. Yesterday, we opened a room hidden beneath the original factory. Inside, we found a recording made by my father for future leadership. Arthur pressed play. The room filled with the warm voice of a man recorded decades earlier. If you are listening to this, then the company has reached another generation. Never forget that these buildings were raised by families, not fortunes. If you ever face a choice between greater profit and greater service, choose the people who built your future with their hands. Money can rebuild walls. Character rebuilds communities. When the recording ended, nobody spoke. The silence carried more weight than any applause could have offered. Arthur slowly turned toward Daniel. Would you like to say something? Daniel stood with the same quiet humility that had followed him from the front entrance days earlier. He looked around the room before speaking. I do not want contracts. I do not want recognition. I only hope the people whose names filled those payroll books are remembered when this property opens again. A building becomes meaningful because of the lives inside it, not because of the price printed on the plans. He returned to his seat without another word. Arthur looked toward the board. I move that the redevelopment project be redesigned to preserve the community hall, restore the historical spaces, establish a permanent training center for working families, and begin an independent ethics review of every decision connected to this project. One by one, every board member raised a hand in support. Preston remained standing alone beside his chair, surrounded not by accusations or raised voices, but by something far more difficult to answer. The room had finally learned the difference between authority that demanded respect and character that quietly earned it. 1 year later, the old Bennett foundry stood transformed, not into another collection of luxury offices, but into Bennett Community Works, a place where history and hope finally shared the same address. The restored brick buildings still carried the character of another generation, while wide glass entrances welcomed every visitor through the same front doors that had once separated status from service. The underground community hall had been carefully preserved as a living museum. The original payroll ledgers rested safely inside climate-controlled displays, and photographs of the factory families covered the walls so future generations would know exactly whose hands had built the city's foundation. Outside, children played beneath newly planted maple trees while veterans, retirees, young apprentices, and local families gathered together for the grand opening. The scent of fresh cedar drifted through the cool autumn air as handcrafted benches lined the walkways, each one built inside Daniel Mercer's workshop by volunteers who wanted the project itself to reflect the values it celebrated. Inside the vocational training center, woodworking classes, technical education programs, and family workshops welcomed parents searching for new opportunities, exactly as Arthur Bennett's father had once imagined decades before. Daniel stood quietly near one of the entrance pillars wearing the same simple blue work shirt that had become familiar to everyone who knew him. He looked no different than he had on the morning he first arrived carrying the cedar box, and perhaps that was the greatest measure of his character. Recognition had never changed him because recognition had never been his destination. Lily, now a little taller and carrying the same notebook that had accompanied her through every important moment of the journey, proudly guided visitors through the historical exhibits, happily explaining how ordinary people could protect extraordinary stories simply by choosing not to throw them away. Arthur Bennett slowly approached Daniel with a warm smile that carried both gratitude and peace. Without cameras being arranged or reporters requesting attention, Arthur extended his hand exactly as he had 1 year earlier. Daniel accepted it with quiet humility. Last year, Arthur said softly, I thank you for bringing my family's history home. Today I thank you for helping thousands of families build their future. Daniel answered with the same gentle sincerity that had always defined him. The future becomes stronger when it remembers where it came from. A few steps away, Victoria Hale watched the exchange with thoughtful eyes. The months following the board meeting had changed her leadership in ways every employee could see. Hiring practices had expanded opportunities for skilled tradespeople. Executive volunteer programs had become part of company culture, and every redevelopment project now required historical and community preservation reviews before construction could begin. More important than any policy, however, was the way she now greeted every visitor herself whenever possible. Titles no longer determined which entrance deserved respect. She quietly walked toward Daniel after Arthur stepped away. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of children laughing, woodworking demonstrations, and live music drifted gently through the courtyard. Finally, Victoria smiled. "Do you remember the first thing I said to you?" Daniel laughed softly. "I remember." She lowered her eyes before looking back at him. "I have wished many times that I could take those words back." Daniel gently shook his head. "If you had never said them, neither of us would have learned what came afterward." Victoria smiled with visible relief. "You once told me that second chances belong to the person willing to admit a mistake. Thank you for believing that before I did." Daniel looked toward Lily, greeting another family at the entrance. People grow the same way wood does. Slowly, one season at a time. Victoria stood beside him as another group entered through the front doors. This time no one questioned who belonged there. Every visitor received the same welcome, the same smile, and the same respect. Lily turned around, noticed Daniel and Victoria standing together, and waved happily. "Come on," she called with bright excitement. "Everybody belongs inside." Daniel looked toward Victoria, and without hesitation, she walked beside him through the front entrance. Sunlight streamed across the restored wooden floors, illuminating the carved cedar plaque hanging above the lobby. It carried only a single sentence, simple enough for every child to understand and powerful enough for every adult to remember. Respect is the first door worth opening. As families continued filling the building, Arthur quietly watched from across the hall, knowing that the greatest legacy his company would ever leave behind would never be measured by profits, but by the lives transformed when one humble father chose dignity over pride, kindness over recognition, and truth over every easier path.